Welcome to Explore, Explain. This is a long-form video and podcast series sharing conversations with data visualization designers and developers from around the world. Each episode explores the detailed hidden thinking behind a single project or a series of related works to explain the what, the why, and the how of the design process. There are some wonderful guests and some wonderful projects to learn about. So let's jump in to today's episode with your host, Andy Kirk.
Okay, good morning. Welcome to Explore, Explain. My name's Andy Kirk, and in today's episode, I'm delighted to welcome Amanda Shendruk. Amanda, hi, lovely to meet you finally. For the benefit of our viewers and listeners, can you briefly introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I am Amanda Shendruk. I'm a visual opinions reporter at the Washington Post. Prior to that, I worked for quite a few years in news. I was a graphics reporter at Quartz. I worked at Maclean's magazine, which is a Canadian magazine, a bit at The Guardian here in the UK, and freelance for some other places. So I've sort of been in visualization and news for about 10 years.
Perfect. And what a kind of golden period it's been for that industry, I guess, over that last 10 years. And what we've got today is a really fascinating project that you worked on earlier this year. And if I recall correctly, it was your very first piece for the Washington Post Opinions, which is super and should be celebrated. And this is a project called, or titled, Audiences Want a Different Climate Change Message Hollywood Should Deliver. So we're going to dissect the sort of hidden thinking and the visual thinking of this project. But just for the benefit, especially of the listeners, could you sort of briefly outline what this thing looks like, what it's about, and we'll move into the details thereafter?
Sure. Yeah, it's a digital piece. It's a piece in which I argue that movies have quite a bit of cultural influence, and Hollywood could use that influence to play a really important role in tackling the climate crisis if it wanted. I argue that the industry should produce more different types of climate movies, not just sort of doom and gloom apocalypse films, and because they've done it before with other topics, and so they could do it now too. Visually, it kicks off with some looping GIFs of some famous scenes from climate disaster movies like The Day After Tomorrow, that kind of thing. And there are also a couple looping GIFs from some other films I talk about further in the piece. And then there's a relatively simple, actually, data visualization of all of the climate change movies we could find, and a bit of a breakdown showing which ones are, showing that the vast majority are doom and gloom type movies.
You're absolutely right. And it wasn't until I read this piece that it made me think, oh yeah, you're absolutely right. These are always catastrophic events and things that seem to sap the hope from everything. But yeah, there's an influence there, definitely, that can be sort of switching this story. And you mentioned there that, you know, the visual treatment that you give to the data is relatively straightforward. We'll get into the details later, but you know, this is a project where the hidden part of the iceberg is a huge amount of data classification work and thinking, and we'll get into the details of that shortly. But just to sort of kick things off, and obviously we've spoke about this already as being a piece for the Washington Post Opinions section desk. I'm not quite sure the correct naming convention internally, but
both are fine.
Both, okay, cool. I'm just wondering, kind of, what are the circumstances in which a piece like this emerges as something to work on? I'm thinking, you know, is it something that involves you pitching to colleagues and say, I've got an idea of something that you've wondered about, or is it a team effort, or is it something that's responding to current news? What's the sort of the origin story behind a piece like this?
Well, so there's four of us that do sort of graphics, visual reporting in the opinion section, also sometimes called the editorial section.
Right.
There's four of us, and we all do quite a few jobs. So I do everything from pitching my own pieces and reporting them, which was the case with this one. This was my idea. I pitched it, I reported it, and produced it, to helping some of the columnists with creating data wrapper charts, to working with the editorial board to create more visually appealing or visually appealing editorial arguments, or working with the columnists with their arguments as well. So there's a lot of collaboration on the team as well. But for this one, this was one that I pitched and produced.
And I know that you're only still in the first part of your first year in the opinions section. And I suspect that quite a few people out there don't necessarily notice the difference or the distinction between an opinion section and other sort of reporting desks. But I just wonder to what extent it's a responsibility that weighs a little bit heavier than other reporting, because the opinion section by its description seems to be, the voice of the post. You are sort of speaking the opinions. These are not saying here's what's happening in the world, here's what we think about something. And I just wonder whether that is simultaneously more responsibility and pressure to get the right line. I'm not saying that you are the voice of the post, but you are trying to find an editorial line. But also, maybe it is a bit more liberating than just reporting on the news in perhaps other desks. I mean, what's your sort of reflections on the first few months and how it distinguishes from other experiences, I guess? Easy question.
I think I could probably talk about this for a very long time, because I was in news up until March when I started in this position. And I agree with you that a lot of people don't understand or think about or care about maybe the distinction between news and opinion, because it's not always that simple. But basically, the news section tells you what happened, as you said, and the opinion section offers ways to sort of think about what happened, or how to respond to or understand, or different
what it
perspectives.
all means.
Yeah. And traditionally, and at the Post, they are kept quite separate, because it's a way to signal that the reporting on the news side is meant to be unbiased. It's meant to be independent and not influenced in any way by a perspective or a political agenda or something that you might see on the opinion side. And so, coming from the news side, being somebody where it was drilled into me for my entire career thus far that I should have no opinion, no outward opinion on this, that I shouldn't, that the reporting needs to be unbiased, that there should be no take or angle or anything. And then on my first piece, it's an entirely different ballgame. Now I'm being told, well, what do you think about this? What should people think? What should we do about this? Those kind of things. And while I enjoy it, it was a hard switch, and I'm still in the process of that switch, but because I was, sort of trained one way, to now flip to the other way has been interesting and more challenging than I expected. I'm getting, more and more free and feel that it's easier. But certainly at the beginning, when people would say, well, what's your opinion about this? I would say, well, my opinion is that people should know this. And that's not really an opinion. That's kind of the entire basis of the news side.
Yeah. That's interesting. And I suspect there's probably a similar need for, I don't know, like businesses and organizations to switch from just reporting what's happening internally to saying what it means and translating all these quantities and things that we see, and what does it actually mean? And I think that shift may take place in due course. But the other thing that I guess which this also signals is a shift from just the opinion section being written and almost exclusively written form to visual. And I guess the harmony of the words and the quantities, and in this piece the imagery as well, is it's a nice canvas for you to work to. You've got all these different ways to express what it is you're trying to convey, and we'll get into those details in due course. But just going back to the origins of this particular story and the wondering that you had and the curiosity that you had. I mean, do you remember when it first popped into your mind about, now I wonder what could Hollywood do about climate change? I mean, were you watching a movie? Because I'm particularly thinking, I remember the aftermath of the Don't Look Up movie and all the debate about that. And actually, it was just brilliantly, it kind of captured the whole essence of the movie in itself and how it was responded to. But that was the first time that I felt there was a slightly more, I don't know, deliberate messaging from a movie about climate change. Although, again, in that one, it was doom and gloom. Sorry, spoiler alert. It was a bad news film. What did you have something that kind of just triggered this thought, this particular angle that you pursued in this project?
Well, I'm very interested in climate reporting and covering climate change and
Yeah.
the climate crisis and sustainability. But I also find that it's a difficult topic to get people interested in. There's a lot of jargon. There's a lot of important science and stuff to understand, and so it can be tough to, even if the reporting is really great, it can be tough to engage an audience. And then on top of it, a lot of the reporting is very rightfully scary, because a lot of scary stuff is happening, but it turns a lot of people off reading about climate change. However, it's the most important thing globally right now, and the biggest challenge that we have to face as an entire world. So I am very interested in trying to find different ways, I suppose, to talk about the topic. So find sort of side doors or back doors into the conversation about climate change, because really climate change can be, it's not just a story about the the weather. It's a story about everything in our lives at this point. So when I think about ideas, I think, honestly, I can even just pick a random thing and say, well, how do windows have anything to do with climate change? What's the story there? Or books or movies. And so I just thought, well, is there something to think about climate change with movies? And because I'm a data person, I immediately went, I wonder if anyone has data on this. What data would there even be? And so that's kind of where I got started. I found this academic, and then I fell into it. And I had the idea when I was working in news, so I had to change it a bit, because what I had originally wanted to do with this piece, the original idea had been something about just explaining the different types of climate change movies, and a bit more of an explorable data viz, kind of just general interest or interest type piece. But that's not what we do in the opinion section, so I did have to change it. But it just came from always being interested in trying to find different ways to talk about climate and get people interested in the topic.
That is interesting, yeah. So taking that sort of, it's almost like a drill or an exercise to sort of think about some kind of inanimate object and then kind of work out how it has an effect or how it's affected by. But obviously, popular culture, movies is a bigger landing area for lots of people to probably have a connection to this. So I really like that idea. And you mentioned there about the academic who you discovered, and so just moving on to the sort of the people who were kind of involved or surrounding this project. So you mentioned in your description Michael Svoboda. Apologies, Michael, if I've mispronounced that, but Michael Svoboda, who is the assistant professor of writing at George Washington University, but he did a lot of research about cli-fi, which I've come around to loving as a sort of shortened version of climate fiction. So how did you come across Michael's work? Or was it just
I agree.
a search?
I love a good portmanteau. Although cli-fi, it's not the best one. But
I keep thinking it's client fiction, and I didn't need to stop it. It's climate fiction, yeah.
Yeah. How did sorry, I missed your question, because I was thinking about how much I like portmanteaus.
Yeah. No, just how did you come across Michael's work in relation to this research that he's done?
Yeah, when I get a topic in my head, I think, well, where's the data? And so I was just Googling around looking for climate change data or climate change and movies data. And there's not a lot of analyses done about, well, particularly The Day After Tomorrow. There's a million analyses done about that one movie. But there's not a lot of data out there, actually, that people have collected. There's starting to be a bit more. But this was... he had a paper published in 2015 or 2016 where he had just classified all of the climate movies he'd watched. He's just generally very interested in climate movies. And so he had kind of just on his own categorized them and grouped them into different, storytelling buckets and that kind of thing, and written a whole piece on it, which I found really interesting. And I thought, if I could contact him and get him on board, I wonder if he'd be willing to update his data, and we could do it together. Because the difficult thing about this is you can't just scrape something necessarily to get, it's hard to get allegory from scraping, a script or something. So you need someone to watch them. And he had watched them, and I wasn't going to watch 100 movies. So So we combined, I called him up and I said, are you interested in this? Because this is something I think would be a really cool thing to do together. And he happens to be in the Washington area. So he was also really excited because it's, it's his local paper as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, he was willing to do that with me.
Super. I mean, the other person who's named in the article, a lady called Jane Joyner from Good Energy. She's also somebody who contributed more kind of commentaries and comments in the written part of the work. And I wondered, at what point, from your perspective, as as you said, the producer of the whole piece, are you mindful of the need to get more and more voices into the article versus thinking, actually, this is probably sufficient in terms of the breadth of expertise of contributors? How, I don't know, I guess this is more of a question of you as a reporter, somebody who's pulling the copy together, but how do you kind of get a sense of, I've got enough voices here?
It's a really good question, and it's something that I'm figuring out how it differs between the news side and the opinion side. So she was someone that I interviewed and talked with for a long time and helped shape my own thoughts on the opinion. And so I wanted to make sure her voice was in there because she is an important player in helping to encourage Hollywood to do more of this kind of thing.
Yeah.
As far as when are there enough voices, I didn't include everybody that I interviewed. So there's always a lot of research that goes on behind the scenes that you don't always include. I think in a news story, I would have included more voices, but because this is an opinion piece and it's not so much about having the most number of authoritative voices in there.
Right.
The point is more, how does this serve the argument that I'm trying to make?
Sure. Yeah.
And it was interesting actually, with my editors having that discussion, because just because I just come from news, I originally wrote it very newsy and I had tons of quotes and stuff in there. And they were like, well, this is interesting, but this isn't, all these quotes don't necessarily serve making your argument. So when you write an opinion piece, it's a totally different structure than a news piece as well.
Yeah.
So enough, I guess, that's a tough question. But something I do like doing is including at the end of the piece sort of a box saying, how I got the data and that kind of thing. And then in there, if I've interviewed a bunch of other people that I didn't include in the piece, I like to say in there, because I think that it gives my voice more authority if people know that I didn't just come up with this off my dome,
Yeah.
I talked to a lot of smart people who helped me come to this conclusion.
Right. And I guess it's not like an academic paper where you're having to justify every quotation or every piece of I don't know, proposition in there. It's something that you're saying, you kind of collating all these bits of inputs and then you're sort of, I guess, digesting that into what you write about it. But you also mentioned there about the things that we don't see, and I wondered to what extent, it's a longish piece, but it's not a million miles long as some other storytelling pieces can end up being. Is there a house style that sort of suggests this is the kind of duration of reading that we want to max out as the limit for a reader of this piece? Or are there other dimensional constraints that you're having to sort of work to?
We don't really have a word count or something like that. It's more about, for me, I don't enjoy pieces that are unnecessarily long. I enjoy a good long piece if it should be long. But the type of work I like doing is to cut everything to just its real essence, to get to the point. And so it's a style that I enjoy. But it's also, every decision I made was about how does this further the argument, or how does this back up the argument? And so we'll probably talk about it later, but in the data section, for example, there's tons and tons of data behind that I didn't use, that I would have loved to use. And there's other data set that I collected that I didn't end up using. And it was because this piece wasn't about, hey, here is an interesting analysis of doom and gloom apocalypse movies. It was, it was about using the data as a tool in the argument.
Yeah. And the other thing about, well, the other question I was going to quickly ask, which I think I already got the answer to, but this only exists as a digital piece, right? It wasn't in the printed newspaper.
No, it was in print. It was in print.
Really? Okay, excellent. Now,
Yeah.
I've not seen that version. I mean, I guess you don't have videos and GIFs in that version, but are you having to therefore design one piece to fit both largely, or is it just a completely different writing exercise for the two outputs?
I design for digital. I design for
Right.
online. And then if it's a piece that the editorial team decides should go in the paper, then I need to rejig it a bit.
Got you.
Basically, instead of the looping movies, I had a few stills.
Yeah.
It didn't really have to rewrite too much. I could still include the visualization, although it wasn't on a color page. So it was a little tough to, highlight well the movies. It's not a print first piece. It's more ideally experienced online, but it doesn't take that much to really make a few tweaks to make it accessible to the print audience.
Yeah. And then the last contextual factor I wanted to just explore was the timescales. You're not working this to and again a term that I've recently learned, that a news peg. It's a little bit more of an independent cycle of a topic in a sense, but that doesn't mean that you are free of deadlines, free of timescales, free of limits on your amount of time you can give to this. What are some of the sort of time dimensions that you were facing for kind of working at this project?
Well, like you say, because it didn't have a news peg, which isn't the case for all of the things I do, but for this one, it didn't.
Yeah.
It didn't have a serious deadline. So I'm always working on multiple things at once. So I'll usually have a piece that I'm making and producing and reporting on the go, and then on the side, or on the the rest of my time is spent helping other people or collaborating. So if I had just sat down and done this, I don't know, it would have taken a few weeks.
Yeah.
But it took, I don't know when I published it. It took a month and a half or something.
Right.
But that's also because I'm asking Michael to do a bunch of work to help me with this as well.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to say, hey, can you update your data this week so I can get this out next week. So I just gave him a bunch of time to do his thing, and there was really no rush on it. We do sometimes do things though that are pegged to the news that need to come out quicker. But with this one, there really were no worries about time, which is nice. Rare.
Absolutely. And again, just before we get into the data stage, when you first sort of embarked on this work, I'm just wondering what ideas were in your mind at that point about what it might look like, any other works that you'd seen that you might wish to emulate or avoid, because I guess there's part of this which is also to stand out as being a different piece to how others might have tackled a similar-ish project. But did you have any initial ideas, sketches, or more broadly, what's your sort of process for that kind of initial idea forming stage?
I did have my initial idea was far more focused on the data, and it had a visualization that was more interactive, and you could filter by different things like how well the movie was rated and stuff like that. And I slowly took that out until basically there was no interaction. As I realized that it wasn't necessary to make the argument, and in fact might detract from it.
Got you.
One thing I thought about, I didn't really have any particular inspiration, though I'm sure there's things in here that have come from just years of looking at stuff. But I did think a lot about the color, because green is so often used for climate pieces. And on one hand, that's good because it immediately triggers people to think climate. If you want that quick association. But I also think, it triggers all the other things that people associate with climate stuff, which is sometimes that it's boring, or that it's inaccessible, or that it's just going to be about
trees.
I don't know, trees.
Yeah.
And so I didn't want that. I wanted I didn't want to use green. I don't know, maybe I put way too much thought into this, but I didn't want to use green because I wanted it to be not just categorized as a climate piece. I wanted this to be, for some people that are interested in movies, this is a piece about movies and about Hollywood, not about climate. So yeah, I had thought a bunch about green, I suppose.
No, but I think you're absolutely right. And sometimes those kind of color connotations that exist with the subject are useful as shortcuts for something that's recognizable, but on other occasions they can be detrimental cliches and you want to go the opposite way. So no, I get that completely.
Yeah. You know, there's one aspect that as I was reporting, I discovered, and I really wanted to use it visually somehow, and I just was never able to do it. I had to collect all of the movie posters for all these movies, and there were 100 of them, and I realized how many of them are the same. So I don't know if you can picture the Day After Tomorrow movie poster is the Statue of Liberty, and it's kind of frozen over with new, holding up the torch, kind of frozen in the background. The number of movies that then copied that, which had a Statue of Liberty in the poster, was incredible. There were tons of them, and then the number of movies that copied Twister as well. Twister is pretty iconic. And so I started collecting posters that looked the same. And I thought that was so interesting because there wasn't even any creativity in the posters. Like they're clearly just recreating Twister, which did well, and recreating Day After Tomorrow, which did well.
Interesting.
I couldn't really ever find a way to integrate that. It was kind of just an interesting side thing, but I was thinking about that.
That feels like a broader spin-off type exploration into movie posters in general about their influence on that world. But yeah, we'll tackle that next time. Okay. So just moving on to the data stuff. I mean, you've already kind of alluded to the work that Michael has done in the research initiative, which I think you mentioned was 61 movies / TV series. It's not just movies that had, and it's not just a climate change message. I'm just going to look at my words here because I need to get this correct, because it's about movies or TV series that had human-induced climate change playing a role. So I've got that correct, hopefully. So it's either as a plot point, a backdrop, or as an obvious subject or allegory. Because when I was first looking at this work, I was expecting, for example, Avatar to be amongst it. But it's not, because it has environmental themes, but they're kind of secondary to the kind of human story there, and the battle between human and it's not part of the categorization that Michael applied. So the data goes back from 1966 with the first movie marked out as Our Man Flint, which I know of but I can't remember at all, right the way through to 2023. Now you expanded that from 60, or sorry, you commissioned Michael to expand that from 61 to 100. Was that just an arbitrary number, or did you suspect that there were just a few more movies missing and it ended up being 100 and a very nice, neat number?
Yeah, I was a little ticked off that it ended up being 100, actually, because those clean numbers make you think that it's too precise. It's not right. But it just ended up being 100. I was desperately trying to find another so it could at least be 101. But that's just where we ended up. So what happened was Michael had in that first article that he published 61 or something, and then he published online later on maybe 20 more or something. So I kind of aggregated all of his findings, and then together we added about 20 more, and we did that by I just scoured every blog, movie site, IMDb, everything I could possibly find where people were talking about climate movies or categorizing climate movies or anything like that. And like you said, TV series as well. And so I should be very clear that this data is very imprecise, and it's very subjective. And, we put those boundaries on it, that it was something where climate change was a significant plot point or allegory or I can't remember.
Backdrop.
Backdrop. But there is probably a good argument to be made for any of these movies not being on the list, or any other movie to be on the list. Like it's difficult to categorize that. But we did the best we could to just find everything possible. It was the best way I could figure out. I didn't know any other way to, I combed through the climate tag on IMDb. So we grouped as many together as we could. And I think we watched, or he watched, or between us, we had watched almost all of them. There were a few where we did have to read the synopses and sort of read other people's takes and stuff and decide whether it fit or not. But certainly the majority were watched by Michael. And I think that was important because how I might classify something would be different to how Michael might classify it.
So it needs that consistency. Yeah, there's
consistency in that this is his classification of these. And he made it clear that he wasn't including ones like WALL-E or Avatar or something that were more on an environmental theme. He really wanted to focus in on man-made climate change or human-made climate change.
Yeah. And then within that, so you've got this big population of movies with the themes as a kind of criteria for inclusion. And then within that, there's this kind of marcation between those that determine whether disaster, destruction, apocalypse, or dystopia were a feature. And I guess that'll be another important thing for him to consistently apply his lens to what he's saying is or isn't. I mean, do you know how he even did that? I mean, is he looking for some particular scene or some particular thing or motif that sort of triggers that sense of, that's a disaster destruction type thing?
Yeah, I think if I can't remember exactly what it was. He had a system, and he wrote about it in that paper from 2015 or whatever.
We'll share the links to the paper he wrote.
Yeah, I don't remember his exact definitions, but he had definitions. But again, it's sort of subjective. There is no way to, perfectly say what is or isn't. But he did very detailed classification. So when we say movies that feature disaster and destruction, apocalypse, or dystopia, in the end, we lumped those all together to just show the kind of doom and gloom movies. But those were all categories that he had found, and he had found other categories like comedy and superhero and alien, and so he had them categorized into quite a bit of detail, and then with certain plot points. And at one point, we were trying to figure out if we should include whether the movies offered solutions. Because if you look at the ones that offer any kind of solution or positive outlook on climate change, they're almost none. But we decided to go with this a little bit more general framing. We found data on, or I added data to his set on IMDb ratings or Rotten Tomato ratings and things like that, and found that, a lot of these movies are actually quite poorly rated as well. But again, it's because the data itself is so imprecise or sort of hand wavy. I didn't want to do too many layers of further data analysis on top of it either to make any statements that were too strong, because I think a sort of small data set, there's 100, and kind of imprecise data set lends itself well to generalish statements and maybe not super niche statements.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that sense that you could be tempted at least to embark on quite an analytical treatment of all this, but it would give implied statistical precision to things that are qualitative, that are, it could be this, it could be that, but the general point is that there's just tons of movies that are just giving this really kind of depressing message. So I think that's right.
Enough. It's enough data that it makes a strong statement about the breakdown of movie types. Of climate movie types. It's not good enough data to make precise comments about those. But in aggregate, it's strong.
And I think that's an important message for a lot of people working with data that is inherently imperfect, inherently uncertain, that it doesn't mean that you can't proceed, but just proceed with a degree of caution of what you draw from it and what you draw out of it as a message. But you can still go with uncertain data and draw just broader comments. So you've talked there about some data that you could have had and you could have used and you could have explored further. But the other data that is included in a lot of your written sections are to kind of give this extra context to the influence that movies and Hollywood and TV series have had on other societal, medical, civilization issues. And in a sense, when you read them, you might just read it as a single sentence, but that belies the amount of work that you would have had to do to research that is a thing. So, for example, the growth in sales of dog breeds that you mentioned in the article, the increase in the HIV/AIDS hotline use, the number of propaganda movies from Hollywood during the Second World War. These are not just casual facts and figures that are just lying around for you to pick up and easily drop in. I mean, how much extra work did you have to put into sort of research these to build out again the premise of what you're saying, which is this industry has influence, it's had influence in the past. So yeah, what's the sort of workload that went into that?
So some of those I did get from studies. I did a lot of researching, just reading studies of the influence of movies. There are a lot of studies to wade through because very few try to put any data to it. So it's tough to find, but those were studies. And there's a statistic I use in there about drunk driving and how Harvard worked with a bunch of TV companies in the 80s, I believe, to put messages about drunk driving in their in movies like Cheers or TV shows like Cheers and stuff, and how effective that was. There's big studies that have been done on that, the impact of that kind of thing. The one though that I did do a lot of my own research into, which basically none of it shows up in the piece, which is disappointing, but it's, you got to cut the stuff you love if it doesn't fit the brief, was about the World War II movies. That was fascinating. I managed to find a book actually in a reference library here in Edinburgh, an old book that had a list in the back of all the war movies that were produced by Hollywood and in which years. And they did something like 300 movies over 4 years or something. It was incredible. They were this massive propaganda machine. And I probably took too much time going down a rabbit hole, reading all about like how Hollywood became this war machine.
Right.
But I thought it was a very interesting aspect of this because it demonstrates, and again, I don't go into it a lot, but it demonstrates the power that Hollywood can have. It's not all good power. There was a lot of racism and things like that came out of those movies. But it still demonstrates the power.
There. Exactly.
And that was really interesting because the whole industry and country kind of came together and said, we need to make these movies for this purpose. So I did a lot of looking into that, and I wanted to do a visualization of that as well, but it really wasn't the point of the piece, and it didn't.
Well, to what extent might you, I don't know, revisit that? I mean, I guess you must have this huge, I don't know, wish list or ideas list of intrigue and curiosities. I mean, is this something that you just would log and then say, maybe I'll come back round to that in due course if there's a moment in time when that kind of analysis might be of interest again?
Yeah, I mean, I keep it all up in my head. It's with reporting, it's easier a little bit to do more kind of incremental things or smaller things, or to put out a piece that said, look how interesting the history of war cinema has been. In order to do it on the opinion side, there would need to be some kind of angle or reason to do it that has something to do with what's going on in the world, or a perspective that offers. And I'm sure there is one. I'm not an expert in war cinema, so I'm not sure what that would be, but I definitely keep all of that stuff in there.
Look forward to seeing sometime. Exactly right. So moving now on to the sort of design thinking, and I guess the first thing to note is the general structure of the piece, which you've already sort of outlined, but just in very blunt terms, we start with a title, and then we've got this sort of scrollytelling banner that sort of sets the context of the piece, where we've got a few video clips kind of overlaying with captions to sort of say, here's the kind of doom and gloom that exists in Hollywood climate movies. And then we get to the byline. So it takes a while to even get to the sort of the almost like the title and the byline. Normally that's at the top, and this is, you've gone through a little bit of a teaser to get to that. And then we kind of bounce between different sections of copy, of written content, more clips, more copy, more visuals. I just think a broad question is, how do you end up with that architecture? Are you doing sticky notes and arranging some kind of narrative? Are you just going with the flow of how you feel is the logical way to both introduce, set the scene, and then go to the, not the big reveal, but the big kind of call to action at the end? What's the sort of process you follow for the structure? We'll get into the details of that structure later on, but the overall architecture, what's the story behind that?
Again, it comes down to how does it serve the argument? And so with opinions writing, it's more like maybe what we learned to do for essay writing in high school or something. You know, you have your thesis and then you back it up.
Right.
And so you need to get to your point really fast, immediately at the beginning. And the point was, too many doom and gloom movies. Here's what we should do about it, or here's what Hollywood could do about it. And so the reason for the videos right at the top are to immediately remind people, and simply and quickly, easily remind people how destructive these movies are by showing just a few that most people will know. And right, there's that clip of New York getting washed away by a wave, or the earth getting destroyed, or whatever. And so that's more of a, I like what you called it, a teaser, to sort of remind people what these types of movies are that we're talking about. And then I had originally had a version where you had that, and then the videos part to say, here's my evidence that there's too much doom and gloom, too many doom and gloom movies. What should we do about it? But we, through a number of iterations working with editors, we thought that it would be stronger to say there are too many of these. Hollywood should do something about it, and get to the point, or give people a little bit of an argument teaser to say, well, there's a reason we're arguing this. Hollywood has a lot of influence. It's not just something we've plucked out of the air. Hollywood should do this. Hollywood has a lot of influence. So to get into that, and then to go back to here's our evidence for the problem. There are different ways, certainly, we could have set it up.
Well, of course, yeah. But no, I'm sorry to interrupt there. I just think it does feel like we often perhaps overuse the term storytelling. And it's not necessarily that this is an explicit story as such, but it is the deliberacy of structuring a message, structuring something that you're trying to explain, and also structuring something around the rhythm of how people might read and be drawn into a piece, which is get there quickly, and then you might have grabbed them, and then they might be willing to go into a bit more depth to kind of to go into that the bigger sort of backstory, because people's time is precious and people's attention span is inconsistent and unpredictable. So I get that, and I wondered if by extension that was perhaps where the choice for having little video clips was included. They could have been still frames, I guess. Was there a sort of a weighing up of whether to go still, dynamic in those, and 3, 5, 10 movies? What was the sort of thought process for that?
Well, at the top where they're all just little looping GIFs, but at the top I wanted them to be not stills, because so something I'm learning in the opinions department is that there are all kinds of different ways to make an argument, and the one that I most prefer is data, backed up, reasoning. But emotion plays a really big role, and those movies they kind of bring in a more emotive aspect. Because they show the destruction right away, and yes, they grab attention, but they also say we're doing a piece about movies, and they go, oh, there's the earth getting destroyed, kind of like a little punch. So it's a different type of tool in my argument toolbox, I suppose. 3, because I don't think it's a good number. I mean, 5 is too many, 1 is too few, and with the other clips, those ones were, again, it's they're famous scenes, and it's easier. It's just one of those things where it's easier to show than write. I could write a couple sentences about how Will and Grace impacted the discussion around same-sex marriage. But if I just show that scene that a lot of people remember from Will and Grace where they're kissing, that brings back a lot more than just maybe a sentence would. So I could have done that in a still as well. I think the three in the middle, they could have been stills, but I might as well match the top. I wanted to have a similar feel. So
yeah, and it does have that balance, and it has that kind of echo. And you've got three, and you've got three, and they're all the same duration. So there is a, it's perhaps something that you may not be aware of as a reader, but there is a sort of sense of elegance and flow there that is created. And we're talking about the motion picture, so having moving things just makes a lot of sense to me as a viewer as well. Yeah. And also, just from a technical point of view, these things no longer drain our tools in terms of reading and consumption. So it's not got that same weight of decision making as it might have done in the past. Just kind of moving on to the representation, so that the chart, if you like, which is a section with a bunch of kind of cohorts of periods or eras when movies released before 1990, 90 to 99. I won't go through all the years. It's boring content to listen to me speaking out loud. But the device you've used is, I guess it's a kind of a pictogram type approach, where we've got these movie posters that you mentioned. And now that I'm looking at them, and we'll put this on the video as well, there are a lot of repeated styles that I've just noticed. But the treatment that you give to these is quite subtle, but I think was kind of really nicely judged. And I'll just sort of describe it briefly, and you can sort of speak to why you did this. So the movie posters are by default sort of monochrome, but those that are of this nature, of including disaster, destruction, apocalypse, or dystopia, have got a kind of gold hue filter applied, and then a gold outline to stand out to the others. But then the ones, and I only noticed this recently, but the ones that are kind of commented on have a fully saturated color poster as well, which I thought was a really nice touch. And I was wondering at the time, have I missed something? Yes, there's that little feature. So, and these are organized into sort of blocks of 10s, so you can count them as well as just see how many fill into these eras. I'm just wondering, how did you end up with that approach, where you've got this kind of structure around decades or periods of time, rows of 10? Were you thinking about doing anything more charty, like a line chart, or a sort of stat unit chart to show the number over time? What was the sort of evolution of that solution?
I didn't think that it mattered so much when they were made. So that's why they're broken into decades, just so people can find things, and because it is a bit interesting to see, if they increase or not over time. But again, the data set is so small, I didn't want to say something like there were more in X period versus I think my main consideration was being able to give people the movie poster visual so they could find the movies that they want, because that's easier than looking at a list. And also so that it serves as a list of movies about climate change, which are hard to come by. But also that we get through it relatively quickly, that it is not something that it's not the focus of the piece. It's not the main thing, which again, coming from news, that feels weird, because often the work I would do would be kind of the main focus. The visualization would be the big deal. And sometimes it still is, but in this case, it's just another part of serving the argument. So I wanted to spend some time on it, have people be able to explore and find their favorite movies or see different movies, but also to not have it bog down the argument. So I think I mentioned earlier, I had some other versions I thought that were more interactive and where you could separate them by more styles and more, how they were rated and things like that. But it really wasn't a piece where the piece would be better. With, in my opinion, where the piece would be better with that kind of interactivity, which I don't think is always the case. My colleagues in Opinions did a piece recently, or a little while ago, where talking about, I don't remember what the argument was, but it was about jobs being taken by AI. And in there, they have a lot of interactivity where you can find your own job and stuff. And I think that's really important, because when people can find themselves in the data, That's
Correct.
super important, and it
Yeah.
helps the argument stay, and I think that's it. It really adds to the piece. In this case, it would just be sort of some interesting bits, and I didn't want that to detract from the point I was trying to make. So
Yeah.
that's how that kind of came about.
No, and that makes a lot of sense. I didn't really kind of think about that beforehand, but that sense that you've kind of got the audience into this flow of reading the argument in a written form, and although you do want to back it up with other tools that you mentioned, video clips, imagery, and in this case posters and some visual treatment of those posters, you can break the audience's flow from what they've just got into by having this run for too long, be too exploratory, because obviously interactivity is giving people a task, an action, and that can delay the process of understanding. So that makes a lot of sense. And as you said, in a sense, the data didn't all need to be shown because it's what shaped your argument, it shaped your opinions that you're kind of presenting otherwise. So that does make a lot of sense. And jump in. Go ahead.
Yeah, I do want to say one thing though about I like that you brought up that the movies that were mentioned in the text were
The
in
saturated
full
colors.
color.
Yes, yeah.
And it's interesting that you like that, because if you were to ask me now what I would do different on this piece, I don't think I would do that. I liked it too, but the number of people that said to me, "Why is Spider-Man in color?"
Right.
Or why is Twister in color? And a couple of the movies that were in color are not very bright either. So it really means only Spider-Man stands out. And I think most people that mentioned it were confused.
Right.
And
Interesting.
I think you mentioned that you were initially like, what did I miss? But then you realized the connection. But you're a person that thinks about
I'm looking for
visually
these things.
encoding data all of the time. So I think that I would actually take that out if I did it again, because I think it confused people.
That's an interesting point. Yeah. No, that is an important factor that you're right. We look for these things and we're impressed by these things and the kind of thinking that goes behind it, but it's not always as obvious, especially for although there's a degree of time that you have to give to read this, it can be a fleeting experience for that audience member before they move on to something else. So, yeah, I get where your point is there. Just a quick point: interactivity and the lack thereof is obviously deliberate. I think the only thing that you can do, or you are required to do, if you want to, is to hover over the posters again, which triggers the saturation color. But then you get the detail of the movie name, which I think is a fairly sensible thing to offer. But there's nothing too intrinsic to the experience that requires a lot of the interaction from the audience that might otherwise be there. I mean, we've talked a little bit about the copy as well. I mean, what's the kind of process for the writing side? Are you writing a piece and then running it past a colleague to say, what do you think? How's it looking? What's the sort of writing process that goes with a piece like this?
I start with a bit of research, and then I write out sort of the best way I can describe it is like pseudocode. When you're coding, but you want to write out sort of what you want to code, and you write sort of sentences about what you're going to do with the code. I do this with the argument. So I just sort of write a sentence. This is where I argue this. This is where I argue this, and then kind of roughly put the visuals in there. And because we're a visuals desk, I then talk to one of the editors, like one of the writing editors, to make sure that the argument is strong, that it's something, they help me with, making sure that it's as strong as it can be, really.
Yeah, of course.
And then we kind of go back and forth. I have one of my colleagues who edits the images and the graphics, and then I'll have one of the writing editors edit the words, and it's kind of it's very collaborative in that way. There's a lot of I'd say it's quite iterative. I start and kind of work my way up. I don't ever want to get too far along, so that I don't create a whole piece and then someone says, "Yeah, but this argument doesn't make sense." Or something.
Yeah, and I guess especially for your first piece, you're trying to find that groove that you kind of align with the team at large. And I wondered again, just not to draw this point out too much about the opinionsness of this piece, but I noticed that there's a lot of sort of first person in the written section. And how did that feel? I think this, me, whatever the language that you've used. How did that sort of fit for this first experience?
It felt very weird. And certainly if you read the first draft of this piece, it was very newsy. And I definitely, my editor had to go through a number of times and say, make this sound more like you're talking to somebody. And that's just not what I'm used to. So it felt extremely uncomfortable. But I've come to really value at that time I was thinking, well, who cares who I am? It doesn't matter to put me into this piece. It's not about me. And then I realized recently on another piece I did about climate change, actually the value of that. And I did a piece about how we've seen a lot of terrifying charts and climate records being broken this summer. It's been a terrifying summer. And is there any way to have any hope coming out of this? And I wrote this whole piece about using data to inspire hope and that kind of thing. And as I was nearing the end, I was talking to someone and I said, I don't feel good about this piece because I'm not sure I entirely believe it. I feel that I'm making a good argument. It's a good argument for why we should feel hopeful, but I don't know that I believe it. I don't know that I am hopeful.
Right.
And they said, well, put that in the piece. I'm like, what do you mean? I can't just say that. And they said, no, put that in the piece. And so there's a paragraph near the end that says, this is a hard mindset. This hopeful mindset is hard to foster. And actually, if, I find it difficult because I think that actually the powers that be will not solve this in time. But I also believe that we need this positive mindset and hope in order to actually potentially get anything done. And I found in the comments for that piece, many people took that paragraph and quoted it and said, yes, this is how I feel. This is it. This is the crux or whatever. And that was really interesting to me coming from a news side.
Because I guess you would have,
vulnerable.
I was just about to say that would have made you feel a little bit exposed and vulnerable, but actually that's what people ran with.
Yeah, well, because I don't know that people want to just be told things. They want to, and I'm definitely still in the midst of figuring this all out. I still feel very new to opinions, but I don't know that people want to just be told the facts and the figures. I think they also want to be empathized with and be told, well, it's not black and white, and that this is tough, and but we got to try anyway.
That's it. Yeah. No, that's a nice. I don't know. That must be a nice thing to be experiencing as you're kind of doing this job and find this new, I don't know, this new style, this new language, this new way of being able to express yourself, which is wonderful. Just in terms of a couple of points about the kind of production, the execution of this work, and I think the question that I always find interesting to ask people is, when did you know it was finished? When did you stop changing it, adding into it, doing something different? Because usually there's a time deadline that calls that into play, but in this case, what was the last thing you did?
Well, for me too, it's a deadline. I cannot, as a person, and it's probably because I've been in media for so long, I can't stop something unless there's a deadline. I need a deadline in order to stop. So while there was no deadline for this piece, when we got close enough that we were starting to, we were seeing the end, and I could say, yeah, this could be done in a week or whatever, then we set a deadline. And when we set a deadline, it's not just about me. There is the audience team that is doing stuff. There's, whether or not it goes in print. There's all kinds of other things that depend on if I get it done or not. So for me, it's just a deadline. Honestly, I wish it was something more interesting than that, but I can't stop. I will finesse something.
Of course,
for years.
Well, I suppose on that basis, and this is never to say that there's anything wrong that needs changing, but what would you do differently? And when you've talked already about the removing of that little saturated feature, but are there things that on reflection now you think, yeah, I could have done that differently? Not I would, but I could have done that differently.
Yeah, the saturation thing I would take out. I think maybe I would maybe try to figure out a way to again move the visualization a little higher up and move the second set of GIFs, grouping GIFs, a little bit further down. I'm not sure why, other than that gives me more comfort in terms of balance. Like you have the 3 GIFs at the top, and then you have a visualization,
like
and
a
then the 3
sandwich.
GIFs.
Yeah,
it's like a sandwich. And I originally had it like that, and then I see why we changed it, because I think the argument does flow better this way.
Yeah.
But I think if I had time now, I think I would maybe tweak it a bit to figure out how to do that. But I'm not, that's the kind of thing that I don't think anybody notices except the person who's thinking about it forever, you know.
And also, it's probably just one of those that is literally a 50-50 call, you know, and both versions are equally legitimate, and that's fine. And I think that's what sometimes frustrates a lot of people who are getting into this world, that there isn't the single answer, that's also good and that's also good, and both are fine. Final reflections then. Now, obviously, we've talked a lot about reflecting on this piece because it's far enough in the rear mirror to sort of take that bigger picture view. But I'm just wondering, you know, what your reflections are in terms of what are your favorite parts of it? What did you enjoy doing the most? You know, did you enjoy the background data work, or you know, what are your highlights on reflection for this piece?
I did really enjoy the data work because it's you know, it's kind of a strange data set. It's not super analytical. It was sort of like, how can we take something we want to talk about and try to quantify it the best that we can? And I always find that really interesting. I also really, really enjoyed the conversations I had with people about the topic.
Right.
There's so much that I really wish I could have included in here that was just fascinating stuff about the topic. And I had great conversations with Michael when we were working on this, just about how we choose which type of movie. But you know, as far as talking about things like, why do people like movies like this? I love them. I love apocalypse movies. And why do we love them? And actually, when I was talking with I don't want to get her, I forgot her name, Joyner.
Jane Joyner.
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry. When I was talking with her, she said that in the research that their organization had done, they talked to a psychiatrist at one point who said that we like apocalyptic, world-ending movies because they're comfortable. And that really threw me for a bit. But the idea is that humans dislike discomfort or uncertainty so much that we would rather watch movies about the world ending and rather be certain that the world is going to end than sit in the extreme discomfort of not knowing.
Yeah.
And I thought there's so much interesting, like I could write a book on the topic.
Yeah. Wow.
So I just really enjoyed the reporting process. Something that maybe not a lot of people know is that in reported opinion pieces, which this is, my job from the newsroom to this, if I were doing this piece in the newsroom versus doing it in the opinion section, a lot of the research and the reporting and all of that would be very similar. I did all the reporting like I would have done on the news side.
Yeah.
The only difference is sort of the structure and the way that it's approached, and sort of then the you know, having an angle.
Yeah.
But I really enjoyed the reporting process. Yeah.
And you mentioned, for the last question, you mentioned there the nice observation that someone made about the other climate piece, about you expressing your own uncertainties about how you feel. Was there a similar nice nugget of feedback or commentary that came for this piece? I mean, I noted that when I last looked at the piece, there was 417 comments. We're always told to never look below, never look below the line at the comments. I mean, what's on a more positive basis, what were some of the nice comments, or the nicest comment that you felt came back?
I love the comments. I always read the comments.
Okay.
I think they're fascinating. And yeah, there's a lot of negative comments, but but that's okay, because I'm not, you know, I'm putting out a side, an angle. People don't have to agree. And so I really enjoy reading the comments. This isn't positive, but but I think it's funny, and it does make me laugh. The very first comment on this piece, I actually printed out because it was the first comment that I got on any piece at the Washington Post. And I was so excited. And let me read it to you. It was, what's up with these terrible video scrolling mashups? I'm trying to read the damn essay, not watch clips put together by some bored graphic artist. Wow, I'm really sorry I renewed. And I just thought that
Wow.
was so funny. It didn't make me feel bad at all. And part of me empathizes with them because I actually work really hard to not put too much unnecessary interactivity into things because I don't like that. And so I just thought it was you can work your hardest, you can put your best thing out there, and not everybody's going to agree or love it.
Absolutely right.
And that is fine.
Yeah,
And that's not
absolutely.
a positive comment, but it's also funny, and I enjoyed it. And they have a bit of a fair point in there too, I think.
I think so, yeah. And I think also, I don't know whether you take that on board as a sensible thing to bring into your future thinking. It is a data point to bear in mind about how people experience these things, and there's a little bit of controversy is not the right word. There's a little bit of negative commentary about scrollytelling pieces just for the way that they don't always comply with accessibility and screen readers and things like that. So it's a thing worth taking on board. But also, as you said, it's a first comment. Print it, laminate it, keep it there. Whether it's good or bad, it's happened. So roll with it. But
Yeah.
Listen, Amanda, thank you ever so much. That's been such an insightful and really interesting conversation. So thank you ever so much for sharing all your thoughts and sort of backstory to that project. It's been really enlightening. So thank you. And thank you to all the viewers and listeners. And we'll see you again soon for another Explore, Explain episode. Take care. To see more information about today's episode, including some links to key sites and resources mentioned, please visit my website at visualizingdata.com. Here you'll also be able to find details about my book, information about my public and private training courses, as well as over a decade of blog posts. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking, subscribing, and spreading the word. See you next time.